And within the university system, no, I must place the unions in proper participation for people to understand.
Hello and welcome to the program. President Muhammadu Buhari last Wednesday sent a supplementary budget of 465.64 billion naira to Parliament, or the National Assembly as we call it here in Nigeria, to enable him execute government activities for the remaining part of 2015. Now, 88% of the supplementary budget is for subsidy payment on supply of petrol, and that amounts to 413.36 billion naira. Operation Lafia Dole, which is the term used for Nigeria's war against the Boko Haram insurgency in the northeast of the country, got 39.65 billion naira in the budget, while provision for prison rations and feeding for unity schools got 2 billion naira. We would be talking more about the subsidy budget much later on the program. Now, the National Assembly got 10 billion to cater for balance of severance gratuity and allowances of outgone and incoming legislators and legislative aides. The letter from the president, which accompanied the supplementary estimate, said that new funding requirement was to address security issues and other important obligations. Now, what is perhaps the biggest talking point in the president's letter to Parliament is that he is seeking an upward review of the initial borrowing plan from 882.1 billion naira to 2.103 trillion naira to finance the budget. Now, that in effect means the president is seeking approval to borrow 1.601 trillion naira to make up for the huge deficit of the 2015 budget. Now, in line with his request and the realities of the time, the president reviewed setting indices of the budget. Oil benchmark, for instance, was reviewed downwards to $48 per barrel from $53. Oil production was brought down to 2.2003 million barrels per day from 2.2782 million barrels per day. To discuss this figure further, I'm being joined on the program by Johnson Chukwu, a financial analyst and managing director of Carry Assets Management, an investment firm based in Lagos, Nigeria. Mr. Chukwu, thank you very much for joining us on the program. First, let me get your take on this supplementary budget.
Thank you, Deji. The concerns you expressed about the supplementary budget are genuine to the extent that we are talking of a supplementary budget of about $463 billion, of which 413 billion is for payment of subsidy. And if you look at the entire supplementary budget, they are basically for the current expenditure. And unfortunately, as it stands today, I also expected that the president was submitting the supplementary budget to pay subsidy, which accounts for about 88% of that supplementary budget. The president, I thought, will in the same first swing have also requested the National Assembly that we stop this payment of subsidies. Because as it stands today, if we do not stop the subsidy payment, then we'll be going back to the National Assembly in the primary budget of next year, that is the main budget of next year, and even supplementary budgets of subsequent periods, to look for additional money to pay subsidies. If you look at it, the government will be borrowing about $2.1 billion. And that borrowing is purely for consumption purpose. My concerns are this, that currently our recurrent expenditure, when you add the recurrent expenditure to the debt service obligations at a budget benchmark of $53, it accounted for 85% of our total government revenue. So if today we are paying 85% of our total revenue on servicing of overhead of the government, payment of debt obligations, the headroom for additional borrowing is not very strong. And if we must borrow additionally, it should go to physical infrastructure that will catalyze economic growth. But unfortunately, the current borrowing, the supplementary budget, you mentioned the issue of, I don't have any problem with the amount that's being earmarked for fighting Boko Haram. The other portion of $10 billion going to the National Assembly for payment of severance benefits to retiring National Assembly members and the allowances of incoming Assembly members. The challenge you have is that once you borrow for consumption purpose, you're actually creating a debt trap. And that's, I think, the government should be conscious of, so that we minimize the rate at which we are building up additional debt that is not going into physical infrastructure that will help us to grow this economy.
Isn't it very disturbing that, especially, let's look at the issue of subsidy, for instance, even though we're still going to discuss that much later, that we're actually borrowing to pay for subsidy?
Yeah, that's the concern I just expressed, that the payment, the 88% of the budget, supplementary budget is going to payment of subsidies. And for me, there is nothing wrong with paying arrears of obligations that is due from government. The challenge will be, should we continue to accumulate additional obligations, similar obligations, when the consumption pattern is such that it's only growing? Because you're talking of an increasing population, you're talking of an improving middle class, so you will be thinking of more people buying cars. So for every young man or young woman who puts on his ignition and is running his car, then we are actually burning part of our national wealth, part of our common wealth. And I think it's no-brainer that at this stage, where we've gotten to the point where we have to borrow the entire amount we need to pay subsidy with, it's no-brainer that the government should take immediate measures to stop the subsidy. Because it simply means if we do not, we're going to go back and raise additional debt to pay make subsidy payment in future months.
Let's talk about the benchmark, some of the indices of the budget. We saw a review of the budget benchmark now from $53 per barrel to $48. And then you look at the price of oil today, you know, it's still hovering. Oil is still around the $40, $42 per barrel region. Don't you think that figure, the $48 per barrel that the president the president is actually suggesting now is pretty optimistic?
Well, if you look at, for us to gauge whether that $48 the president is projecting is optimistic or not, we have to look at the futures market in the oil and gas sector of crude. If you look at the futures market as of yesterday was indicating a figure about $38 per barrel of crude. And we have to recognize major facts, and that is the economics of oil price has changed. As long as we have a new source, which is from the hydraulic fracturing and horizontal drilling technologies, which is improving on a daily basis, you're going to see a situation whereby there will be permanent downward pressure on crude prices. Because as prices try to itch up, these wells that are not economically viable at lower prices will become very economically viable, and those who own those wells will pump in additional supply into the market and depress the price again. So you're going to see a crude price that have found settled at a new level of maybe between $35 and $45 or $50 per barrel. So the government estimation about $48 per barrel may be a bit on the optimistic side. I think if you look at the futures market, which is showing you below $40, I think that should be the range the government will begin to project that crude price should settle in the immediate future. Remember that Iraq had just gotten a relief from the US and other international bodies. And it simply means that in the next couple of months, Iraq may begin to pump about 2 million barrels of crude into the market. So you're going to see additional supply coming into the market. But beyond that, you also see improvement in several technologies that are bringing energy, several energy sources. You are seeing improvement in biofuel. You are seeing improvement in solar energy sources. So, and this improvement will continue to go on. You have improvements in battery-powered vehicles. When you have alternative energy sources added to the discovery of shale oil, then you will realize that the oil price level of $120, $130 per barrel may not be feasible in the near future.
In your opinion, what would be the realistic benchmark that the government should be looking at?
You know, that's why I said that we have to look at the futures market. The futures market is currently trading between $38 and $40 per barrel, depending on the crude class or the specification. So I think for Brent crude, we should be talking of not more than $40 per barrel. And if I'm to do that budget, I would base my estimate on about $40 per barrel. In the first place, it's actually better to err on the side of caution, to be conservative when you're estimating your revenue, particularly because it makes sense if we have a budget at $40 per barrel, and ultimately the price goes, if the price is trades about $50 per barrel, we have savings that will give us some kind of headroom in periods of low oil receipts.
Do you see the chance that the Senate, for instance, might decide, I'm talking about Parliament, both the Senate now and the House of Rep, might decide to tinker with that benchmark a bit?
The current National Assembly might find it difficult to do that. Simple reason that there have been a lot of political frictions between the National Assembly and the presidency. I don't think they want to exacerbate that. So if you ask me, based on political exigencies, the current National Assembly asked for the 2016 budget will likely accept whatever criteria or whatever benchmarks that be set by the executive, particularly because they wouldn't want to worsen the tensions between the leadership of those agencies, those legislative arms and the presidency.
Now, how worrisome is it that we're having to borrow such huge amount of money? I mean, altogether now, we're looking at 1.601 trillion naira. That's what the president is seeking to borrow to fund the 2015 budget. And 2015, anyway, is on its way out.
Well, we have to recognize that that as it stands today, previously, there are revenue shortfalls that the government is encountering, because if you cast your mind back at the 2015 budget preparation, it was based on a benchmark of $33 per barrel. Crude has been trading about $45, $48 per barrel. So over the past 10 months, the government's revenue has been far below the expectations. When you mention in terms of volume, average production has been about between 1.8 to 1.9 million barrels per day. Budget was benchmarked on 2.27 barrels per day. So you have both volume negative variance and price negative variance. And both factors have built up a lot of shortfall between projected revenue and actual revenue. So the borrowing that the government is trying to do now in the supplementary budget is partly to offset the shortfall that they had encountered in terms of total revenue and total expenditure in the past 10 months.
Now, things are very tough in this country now, there's no doubt at all. There's liquidity squeeze, you have the forex problem and all of that. The economy is just not doing well, there's no question. How do you think we can get ourselves out of this economic logjam, so to speak?
Well, I will start by saying there's actually there's no easy fix to it. There's actually no light bulb effect. You're not going to get into the dark room and switch off put on the switch and the place become brightened overnight automatically. The economic problems we are facing today will require a lot of articulated and concerted policy initiatives to take us out of it. One of which we should look at is this: how do we inject fresh liquidity into the economy so that the banks can lend to these sectors of the economy at single digits? You need to trigger economic activity by injecting liquidity into the banking system. And one of the approaches I have actually advocated that the Monetary Policy Committee should reduce the cash reserve ratio from current 31% to maybe 20% and inject additional liquidity into the banking system. We should reduce the monetary policy ratio from current 12%, 13% to maybe 12 or 11%, so that the banks will have more money to lend. And then the government should slow down on its borrowing activities. Central Bank is already doing that by reducing the amount of intervention in the open market. So if the banks have a lot of liquidity available for lending purposes, they will have no choice than to begin to look for real sector operators, and they will begin to lend at single digits. That's one factor. The other factor is we need to stabilize the exchange rate. The current policies that are, the current turns and twists we are seeing in the foreign exchange market is not good for decision making. And I can assure you that, look, when you close the window for exit, then you also close the window for inlet. Because basically what happens is that foreign portfolio investors, foreign investors will shy away from coming to your market if they are not sure they can take out their money when they want to take it out. So as you are trying to impose forex restrictions, you are also limiting the number of investors that would want to see your market as an attractive outlet. So we need to address the issue of uncertainty about the FX market. We need to find appropriate pricing, allow the price of the naira to adjust for the demand and supply to arrive at a near equilibrium. We need to do that to make the country attractive for foreign investors. Unfortunately for us, we have very low capacity to generate savings. So we need savings from other climates, other environments, other societies. The global savings pool should see Nigeria, we should make this country an attractive investment destination so that the global savings pool will begin to flow money into the economy. We don't have enough savings to pursue economic development at the level we want it. The other factor I want to mention is that government will need to look at a structure, a legal framework, and an economic framework that will attract private capital into critical infrastructure, such as road network, the rail system, the airports, the seaports. We need to come up with bankable public-private partnership initiatives, models that could bring in foreign private equity funds to do standard gauge rails in Nigeria, to do highways, super highways in Nigeria, and toll them and recover their money over a period of time. Because the government, as it stands today, does not have the economic resources to inject in those sectors and create the enabling environment that will attract private sector investment in other segments of the economy.
Let me just quickly take you up on this issue of Forex. Of course, you're one of those who have consistently maintained that market forces should be allowed to determine the exact exchange rate. But, what would you say to those who say, look, you just cannot allow your currency to continue to devalue like that? I mean, you have to consider issues of inflation, and that for the ordinary man, it will make things even become more expensive, especially in an economy that is overly import dependent.
Well, I will tell you that that is a bit fallacious to the extent that these are assumptions that have not been tested. In the first place, if you look at our consumer price index, what is the portion of that consumer price index that is accounted for by from consumption of foreign-made goods? More than 60% of our consumer price index is accounted for by locally made food items. So when you have good weather, what the Nigerians eat, cereals, tubers, and 90% of what we consume in terms of basic foodstuff are produced locally. So when we talk of that, if you allow Naira to devalue, you will worsen inflation rate. It's not exactly the truth, because Naira, we've had records of Naira devaluing at the higher rate, and then inflation only eating up marginally. And the basic thing that we have to realize is this: the exchange rate, like any other commodity, another prices mechanism, where supply is less than demand, you have two options to address that gap. One of which is to adopt a control system such that you now set a basis for sharing of the scarce commodity. And in every system that has an allocation, in every system based on allocation, there is all embedded in it corruption. Because you have to find what's the equitable way to give to Mr. A instead of Mr. B. What's the basis to allocate this? So if you cast your mind back, we have had an era of import duty. The import duty system, when we had the import license system, the import license system was fraught with a lot of fraud, because people became portfolio managers that got import license and sold the import license to those who had genuine businesses at the margin. That's the direction we're going to by adopting an allocation method. But the other option you have is allow price to move to a new equilibrium that will even out supply and demand. I mean, simple economics that says that, look, if demand is higher than supply, prices will go up. And when prices go up, part of the demand will go off the market because they can't afford to buy at that price. And part of the additional supply will come into the market because the new price becomes attractive. And the new equilibrium is found. And that also applies to the issue of exchange rate. Because the problem you have is that the adoption of a control and command exchange rate system will compel you to adopt an allocation method. The allocation method is inefficient. It does not allow for economic growth. You are going to strangulate a lot of the vibrant sectors because you're not giving them enough resource to breathe. And for me, if we cast our mind back at periods where we have control exchange rate, we never really grew this economy. Cast your mind, then look at the past 10 years where we had a relatively liberalized exchange rate. And then we had both foreign and portfolio investors in the country. Go and look at the history of foreign direct investment in the country. Nigeria had the highest over the past 10 years. But what is happening now? All that is drying up because investors want to be sure that when they want to take their money, irrespective of the exchange rate, they can take their money out.
Even though some people will argue that some of these most of the portfolio investors you're talking about simply just come here to make money. They don't really come here to invest in the real sector. That they just, so that the argument is neither here nor there.
Well, for me, we can actually look at, if we decide to say, look, portfolio investors are finicky in their investment, they can exit at any time. But look at foreign direct investment. Nigeria has had the highest so far in the past 10 years. And foreign direct investment has gone into telecoms, foreign direct investment has gone into real estate sector. Go and look at the foreign source of those malls you are seeing springing up. Most of them are from outside the country. We've seen foreign direct investment in several sectors of the economy because those who are making an investment, we are sure they will repatriate their dividend, they will repatriate their capital when the need arises. But once you shut out that window, you create an environment that investors will also want to stay away from.
Finally, before I let you go, let me ask you what would be your projection of the 2016 budget? Because very soon, the president, of course, will be presenting, can we say his own budget now? Because we can't describe the 2015 budget as the president's budget. Very soon now, we would see a Buhari's budget. That's the 2016 budget. What would be your projections?
Well, if we have to base my projections on what the president and the vice president has said at some point or the other, they said from January next year, they will start the payment of allowances of 5,000 naira to 25 million families or citizens of the country. That amounts to about 125 billion naira on a monthly basis. So in effect, about 1.375 trillion of next year's budget will be basically earmarked for payment of handouts to families, the poorest families in the country. So that tells me that, look, if we had a budget of 4.4 trillion in 2015 on a budget benchmark of $553, and we only had 566 billion earmarked for capital expenditure, and the profile of the government in terms of cost has not really materially changed. So it then means that whatever capital expenditure we're going to have in 2016 will be purely funded from borrowing. In fact, effectively, what we are seeing, if we have to go by this basic parameter I mentioned, is that we're not going to have any capital expenditure. Because your revenue has gone down, but we're going to be introducing a new expense here that will account for about 35% of our current revenue. So if your budget, your capital expenditure budget accounted for less than 10% of your budget, of your 14 million for your last year's budget, and you're going to have a new expense here that will account for about 5% of your total revenue, then you won't have any room to invest in capital assets or capital infrastructural projects. So that, for me, is a concern. I've also heard things like we are going to have a budget of about 8 trillion. For me, I also have to look at, when you talk of a budget of 8 trillion, I have to look at where will it be funded from. We all know, like I've said repeatedly, that the crude price is going down. We are talking about $48, $47 now. We're talking a futures market about $39. Vis-a-vis this year's budget of $53. So if you talk of a 8 trillion budget, that means you'll be talking of borrowing about $20 to $30 billion. One, can Nigerian balance sheet support a $20 billion borrowing? Do we have the revenues to service a debt of $20 billion today? I think those things are figures that the government needs to play with and make sure that these figures balance. For me, hearing these figures being thrown around indicates that they won't balance. So until we see the framework of that budget, then we will not be able to hazard a guess on how it will look like. But I think it's more of a socialist budget.
Mr. Johnson Chukwu, as always, thank you very much for your contributions.
My pleasure.
Well, we'll take a short break, and when we come back, we'll be looking at the inability of state governors to pay salaries. They've actually come out to say they would not be able to sustain the payment of the 18,000 naira minimum wage. We want to find out why and what exactly can be done to salvage the situation. Stay with us. Every day, every hour, and every minute, news break in Nigeria. Things happen so fast, it's most times difficult to track and comprehend them. But that's what we do right here on DEJI360. 2015, would you want to come back again?
It's like asking Jesus Christ if he knew he was going to die, will you want to come back as the savior of the world again?
We do not just help you track the stories, we break them down, explore all the angles, analyze the issues so that you can fully comprehend the stories and use them to make the right decisions.